So I would like to welcome Gabrielle Serge, the director of the Vittorio Segre Foundation, an NGO that works a lot about the cohabitation, cooperation of different identities. In the world of today, this is a very relevant subject, but not many people are familiar with this term of convivencia, which describes exactly that. And I would like to ask Gabrielle to give us, to say a few words about, first of all, this notion of convivencia and what is the meaning of convivencia in the world of today.
Thank you very much, Polina. Thank you for having me today with you. And it's a pleasure to represent the Vittorio Segre Foundation, which is, as you said, an organization that has the first and foremost mission and purpose of promoting a culture of convivencia among different identities. What do we mean by convivencia? We basically look at the world as it is today, and we asked ourselves, what is one of the major challenges that society is confronting itself with? Well, the question of identities, the nature of the identities, the way we understand identities nowadays at the different levels of society, starting from national relationships at the national levels, therefore national identities, but also within societies, within organizations, in small communities, and of course, confronting the major changes in terms of technology and environment and so on and so forth. The question of identities is at the center of our preoccupations and of the challenge that we have at hand. We started from the consideration that usually identities relate with each other in two main ways, either through conflict and confrontation, trying to impose the superiority of one over the other, and the other one is through the idea that in order to get by and get beyond the confrontation, you have to get beyond the identities. You have to eliminate identities in order to eliminate the conflict among identities. And these two ways of looking at the world are probably showing you in their very definition the shortcomings in terms of what instead is a world that allows for identities to live together. So we try to look at the identities and the relationship among them in order to come up with a new culture, with a renewed understanding and cultural approach that allows for identities not to be put aside or put in conflict, but rather they can be celebrated, and celebrated by the people who perform the very identity in terms of the recognition of the dignity of the existence and the unicity of each identity. Because we, in every aspect of our lives, we perform different identities at different times. I am Italian, but I'm also Israeli, but I'm also a man and not a woman. I'm a Jew, I'm a person with a disability, I'm an intellectual. All of these are part of my identities, and I can go on all day to name them. So the question is, how do we create a culture that allows me and allows each of us to express and expose and manifest and therefore celebrate the different identities we have, but allowing not so much the confrontation with the other, rather the reciprocal understanding that if I have the right to celebrate my identity and the dignity of my identity is plural, this is real, this is true and real also for you and for everybody else. So in this reciprocal element of the celebration and the consideration of the dignity of identities lies the idea of convivencia, allowing us to put our world together in a way in which we don't have to choose between living together, living along each other, and being who we are. And we believe that it's possible to create a culture that represents this.
So from my understanding, from what you said, is the ideas of Convivencia is moving even beyond the notion of respecting different identities, rather than coexisting and fueling each other in a same goal or in a same society. That it's a part of all of us. Instead of being able to respect different people, we will all form something that it's bigger and it's owned by everyone, something like that.
Thank you, Dimitris. I like what you're saying because it's very much true. Let me rephrase it a little, if I may, by just saying that, first of all, when you talk about respect, you highlighted respect is a very limited concept, just like tolerance. It doesn't require a real exchange. It requires my positionings versus your positioning, and I can decide I respect you or I don't respect you. It doesn't need necessarily the encounter in some ways. What we're talking about is a change of perspective. It's a step forward towards the other. But this step forward cannot be done unless we understand the value and the nature of the dignity of the uniqueness of each identity. Because if I do a step forward to you without knowing who I am, first and foremost, not to remain who I am, but at least to know, to have a self-consciousness and a self-respect for myself. If I don't do that first, then I move towards you and I get extremely confused. Therefore, I develop fear and I develop opposition. Instead, what we were talking about is by having strong roots in the ground, in the determination of who we celebrate we are, then we are more able and more prone to make that step forward to the other. Another element of Convivencia that is very important for us, besides the dignity and the reciprocity, which I've talked about already, is the humanism. Because among the many identities that we don't share, we share for sure one identity at least, and that is the belonging to the human species. So that belonging to the human species is extremely important in the creation of that 360-degree approach that you have talked about. But at the same time, we have to recognize that being human is not the only identity we have. It's one of the many. The one that put all of us in touch by making us similar, but then again, not equal or not the same in a sense. Therefore, we can maintain our diversity by recognizing the similarity in our humanism.
Okay, and moving beyond the notion and the idea of convivencia, and how you can say that this idea is relevant with all the problems that we're facing in workplaces and the challenges that we'll be facing ahead?
So that is a very important question, especially nowadays with the context of the pandemic, but this was true also before. But let's look at the pandemic 1 second. The virus has put at stake, put into consideration and has challenged many of the nodal relations in society, the relation of the state versus the citizens, the local governments versus the national and the international governments, the role of organizations and the private sector, the role of the third sector. Each of these have shown shortcomings and strengths. We have repositioned the state at the center of our life, because it's the state that is providing an answer to many of the challenges of the pandemic. But at the same time, we have seen the role, the important, increasingly important role of the organizations in the society and in the communities. So when we talk about the workplace, we have to start thinking about a new, we have to start by looking at the social pact that, the social agreement that the society makes in itself between the states and the public organizations and the private actors and players. We see more and more that there is, because of this interrelationship among the many actors, we need a step forward in terms of responsibility and accountability by every actor, including the private sector. We have seen this growing faster and faster now in terms of environmental sustainability, environmental consciousness, but this is also true at the social level. The social impact, as it's called nowadays, the capacity of organizations to understand and measure their positive or negative effect on the society, on the community, has become one of the many parts of our society. We go a step forward. We've talked about community capitalism, which is something that is coming up more and more in the conversation nowadays, by looking at the enterprise, by looking at organizations, not just as organizations, but as community themselves. First of all, as ecosystems in which inside of them, many relations among many different actors, the employees, the managers, the families of the people, of the workers, those who procure goods and services to the organization come together, and they have to relate. And how do we create a community, a space, an ecosystem in which relations among all these different actors, which come not just with their identity within the organizations, but with all their identities as human beings, first and foremost, can work and can come together? And how do organizations can take a role, can take a stake into making sure that this ecosystem works? So what we're doing is, as a foundation, is talking to organizations, discussing with organizations, helping organizations to implement and promote the culture of convivencia within their own organization. That is, by helping them to realize and recognize and negotiate identities within their context, and by making the question of identities come to the surface, so that identities don't just lie on the ground of the relationship among people, but there is a careful and aware effort to address the question of identities, the complexity of the relationship among identities, and the possibility that even in the workplace, identities can come together and can be celebrated without having to be left aside for the good of the organization and for the good of the actors and the players who live inside the organization. But there is one more point I add in 1 minute, and that is, not only the organization is a community in itself, but the organization is also a player inside the community, a player inside the larger community of society. So how does the organization, and this has to do with future work as well, how does an organization relate to the larger community, the community of the clients, the community of the people who are affected in some way by the presence of the organization? How does the organization take into consideration itself being an identity and an actor inside of the community, and how does it want and need to create a positive effect in the community itself, for the community itself?
What you say is very relevant to what we want to do, because we want to consider the future of work from a human-centered perspective. And taking inspiration from what you said, I will say two examples that I believe are relevant. One is, for instance, that we see with the pandemic, this trend of teleworking, that it's happening, but it's not taking into account the broader circle of the worker, because you can need to telework, for instance, in a small flat with the whole family, with kids that need to have also tele-education, and it can become very difficult. So we see new inequalities coming, and it's not in the culture of the organizations at the moment to consider those factors. A second thing is that we see, for instance, some institutions, like for instance banks, using more and more remote means of communication and having less employees, less physical contact. But this is happening without taking into account the needs and the specific priorities of the clients. So I think these are examples that show that exactly we see this future of work influenced by the advancement of technologies happening very quickly, and with the pandemic much more quickly, without taking into account the basic notions that you tackled in your speech.
I agree completely with you, and let me propose a consideration here, which might be a little provocative. When you're saying it creates a new challenge of people having to work from home, not having enough space, not having enough means, and so on and so forth. We are basically saying, tell me if you agree with me, that the pandemic has just showed another level of our identity. The fact that we are part of a family, we are father or mothers, or we are sons, and we have to take care of other parts of our lives. This is not, we haven't become suddenly fathers or mothers or sons. This part of our identity was just not considered before, because we were supposed to leave outside of the door of the workplace all of those identities which are not relevant to the work itself. What we're talking about is the question of whether is it possible for organizations themselves, for a culture for the future of work that allows us to bring ourselves into work as full people, not having to leave aside part of our work, part of our life and part of our identities, which doesn't mean that we need to perform those identities all the time, but at least we have to have the possibility to be cognizant about this. It's not a matter of specific means or instruments to tackle the problem. It's whether we have a culture in our organization that is cognizant about the complexity of the multiplicity of identities that we bear and we bring forward in our daily life. And this is one answer to your question. I also want to add another specific element, which I think it's relevant to what you're saying. The fact that we need to take into consideration the effect that organizations have on the life of the stakeholders meaning not just the employees and the people who are working for the organization, but also those who are affected by the work of the organization. And the fact that we want to look at organizations in a way that they become accountable for their action vis-a-vis the stakeholders creates the concept, basically moves the concept from stakeholders to what we call the rights holders. Basically, organizations have to understand, and society at large has to understand that for Convivencia, for a culture of Convivencia, we need to consider the others, the other identities, as rights holder, bearing rights vis-a-vis the actions that we perform. And this changes completely the perspective, because if the organization looks at its clients or its employees as rights holder, therefore they have to benefit in some way, the benefit of the well-being, for example, from the action of the organization, then the organization has not just the profit in mind, but has the benefit itself in mind, the right of the benefit itself in mind. So it's a culture shift that is happening right now in society. It's happened for a few years, and it's being, accelerated by the pandemic in this sense.
No, absolutely. And I think that at the end, this could benefit the organizations in many ways if they have this different perspective and if they can recognize the different identities. I heard a funny story about, a big car company in the United States that had a lot of problems with the cars, and they found out that it was because they tested the car only with white men. So all the others who had to drive the cars couldn't fit, in the same way, and this created a lot of technical problems later on. So I think it's very characteristic that there is a tendency not to see the different identities that have to do with any, I would say, workplace or company, or even, state company. And this needs really to change our culture so much. And that's why I believe that the work we are doing is so important, because we must start from somewhere. And it's important that we work with all these stakeholders in order to change this culture.
Thank you for that. I agree with you. As the Vittorio Segre Foundation, we are working at the moment with the Polytechnic University of Milan, the University of Engineering, which is the most important school of engineering in Italy, and one of the most important in Europe. Indeed, on this topic, on these subjects, we are creating what we call the Convivencia model that allows us not only to get into organizations by explaining and creating a process, creating an environment, creating the space for these conversations and considerations to happen, and therefore creating culture, but also to measure it, to measure the impact in terms of profitability and convenience in some way, because we cannot forget that part of the organization where that embraces these concepts. And as we always say, we don't come in to explain anything. We don't come in to give a list of a to-do list of best practices that the organization has to put in place. We come in with this. I think we are having a problem. Okay, we come in with the idea that each organization, each context of the organization has its own specificity, has its own questions and challenges to come at hand in terms of identity. So we come in to create the space and to facilitate the conversation, but each context has to respond differently and fit into their specific needs to the questions of convivencia, therefore creating their own culture of convivencia rather than abiding to a general one.
Okay, I'm not sure if we're running out of time, but I have one small question from what we've asked. And looking ahead with all the new technologies that are coming and how all these will affect the workplace and, well, the future and our world in the future. Do you consider, or how do you consider that all these changes could be used in order to promote this notion of convivencia instead of having technology actually leading the changes? Can we have convivencia and the notion of convivencia leading the technology changes, or actually playing an important role to it?
That's an extremely important question, because, you know, one of the main wrong considerations in society is that technology and technical questions are always neutral. You can use technology for the good and for the bad. Technology is never neutral. Technology, the role of technology is to make the system more efficient and more effective. But the more the technology does that, the more efficiency and effectiveness become the only objective, you know, the only questions at hand, the only challenge, leaving aside all the other questions, all the other values, all the other considerations from a human point of view. We are not just in relationship to make our society more efficient and effective, but we want more from our society. We want to respond to greater challenges apart from the utility. So the question of how we use technology is extremely critical, because the way we approach it can change very drastically what technology does. If we let that technology does its work on its own, then the human side will be left aside, just because it will concentrate on efficiency and effectiveness. This is not just about technology, but technical questions in general. Greece knows that very well. When the European Union approached the debt crisis in Greece with a technical mindset, therefore for efficiency and effectiveness, look what were the shortcomings and the challenges for the people of Greece, because we left aside the human perspective on that. And this is true in every question, including technology, including information technology. So we must remind ourselves, we must bring the cultural aspect at the center of our effort. And in this sense, at the center of our effort should be, in fact, a humanistic approach, and an approach that allows for coexistence and the relationship among different identities to come together and live together without leaving aside their specificity as well.
I think that what you said is very important, and the key issue is the approach. So we need to change the approach, to change the culture, to have a much more human-centered and humanistic approach to the future of work. And in this, I think that Convivencia plays a very important role. We thank you very much for this exchange of views. We hope that we will continue our collaboration with the Republic, also with the articles and other forms of collaboration. We thank you very much, and let's hope that we can make more people thinking about the idea of convivencia and a human-centered future of work.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.